Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Brain and Mind, and welcome to the new format for this evening's event. It's been over a year since we were able to hold this event on site in the Jacqueline du Pré Music Building at St. Hilda's College. Indeed, this event, Music and the Brain, should have taken place last spring and would have been the completion to the 2019-20 Brain and Mind series, which had included earlier in the year Creativity and the Brain and Art and the Brain. For our final event in the series, Music in the Brain, we'd considered including some live music, but all that had to be reconsidered as the pandemic hit us and we all went into lockdown. We postponed that spring event until the autumn, but the autumn found us still unable to meet in person, and the college only beginning to develop the technology that would allow us to meet all our online demands. But in February of this year, we decided to hold our first Brain and Mind online event. For that, we decided to call upon the expertise of the three members of the executive committee here at St. Hilda's, and the topic was Brain and Mind, Understanding the Relationship. That event proved very popular and has thus far received several hundred views. It's still available online if you wish to see it. So we were emboldened by the success of that event, and as it became clear that once again this spring we could not welcome people back to St. Hilda's, we decided to hold another online event and to return to the long-awaited Music and the Brain. We very much hope that we might all be together in St. Hilda's in the next academic year. I should mention that at that time, we're hoping to make this a hybrid event to allow some of our audience to continue to join us online, in addition to those who come to us in person. The reason for this is that we now have a constituency interested in these events that extends well beyond the borders of Oxford. For example, our audience tonight includes those watching us from Lisbon, Bucharest, Bangladesh, Brazil, and other countries. It also allows some A-level students beyond Oxford's borders to join us, and it's very important to us that A-level students do join us and learn how we can approach different topics from the perspective of these different disciplines. So whether online or in college, we will keep to the same format. As usual, each of our speakers will speak for 20 minutes, and we were going to listen to two talks back to back. After the two talks, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A, and that will take us to about 6 o'clock, at which point I'm going to let us have a 3 to 5 minute break. We'll come back and we'll hear the last of the talks, which will be the philosopher, and then we will have a 30-minute Q&A, and you can ask questions about any of the talks that you've heard. Just to help the chat function, when you type your question in, you might want to say something like your profession or whether you're an A-level student before you mention the question, just so we know how to reply and make it more appropriate. I'm going to bring this event to a close at 7 p.m. So for Music and the Brain. Music in some form or other is part of all our lives. For some of us, it's only in the background, but for many, it's very much to the fore. We not only enjoy music, but we want to understand it. Franz Joseph Goll, the father of phrenology, that study that mapped the various regions of our minds onto our skulls, located music, as I understand it, just above the eye. Science has become, well, let's say, more scientific, and modern technologies have led to many exciting developments in our understanding of how the brain registers music. Many of us will be aware of the therapeutic benefits of music. I understand that even in the last stages of Alzheimer's, patients will continue, or at least many of them, will continue to respond to music. And we can find evidence in all cultures and all times that infants can be calmed by song, and they're often taught language with the help of their carers' sing-song communications. Plato recognized the connection between music and the emotions. He also noted the power of music to move us either to virtue or to vice, and he promoted the idea that music is connected to moral vice and moral virtue. Aristotle agreed, emphasizing the importance of music in the education of the young. I understand that ideas connecting music and morality can be found in Confucian philosophy, Hebraic philosophy, and many others. St. Augustine advocated music as a psychological device that can be instrumental in heightening religious enthusiasm. Clearly, something that is observed to have such a powerful effect on us is something we aspire to understand. Tonight, we aim to further that understanding with the help of our expert speakers. Our first of the talks this evening will be from the perspective of neuroscience, and our speaker is Dr. Victoria Bajo, Associate Professor in the Department of Physiology, Anatomy, and Genetics, and lecturer in neuroscience at Balliol College here in Oxford. Dr. Bajo will explain to us a little about how it is that we hear sounds and transform them into patterns of neural activity. Dr. Bajo.
Good evening to everyone. Thank you to the organizers and Sangelda to give me the opportunity to talk today. And let me share my screen with you. My talk today is about harmonies in the ear and in the brain. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge the funding bodies that support my scientific and academic career. I would like to take you in a journey that goes from vibrations in the air to perception of and enjoyment of music in the brain. The first thing that we have are sounds that are vibrations in the air, and these vibrations can be determined in a certain frequency, that is the number of occurrence per unit of time, that is measured in hertz. The range of hearing in humans go from 200 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and this frequency will be related with the pitch of the sound that we perceive. Another property of these waves, sound waves, is the amplitude, that is how far away the sound goes from the undisturbed position, and this will be related with the loudness of the sound that we can hear. But obviously, sounds are much more complex than a single wave. Usually, we can decompose the majority of sounds, including music and speech, in a fundamental frequency that is the lowest frequency in the sound, and a series of harmonics, and these harmonics are in frequency multiple numbers of the fundamental frequency. If you can see in a spectrogram the word hat, we can decompose in time these frequency bands, the fundamental one and the series of harmonics. But let me show this in a more dynamic way. I would like to share with you a spectrogram program that can decompose this in a real time. You can see my voice here and how my voice is composed by these frequency bands that I have, as you can see here, a fundamental frequency and a series of harmonics. This fundamental frequency and the periodicity of the signal will be related with the pitch, whereas the set of harmonics and the number and intensity of those harmonics will rely in the color of the sound or the timbre of the sound. I can modify my pitch and the harmonics if I try to sing. Do, re, mi, fa, sol. Let's go back to the presentation again. But obviously, things are not so simple. Even these complex sounds are never in isolation. Then we need to deal with multiple sound sources that are happening almost at the same time. It is the case of an orchestra where you have many musics playing together, a choir, or in here in Oxford would happen in a noisy hall during dinner time, right? And the only thing that we separate from these sounds are two tiny tubes that end in a membrane that vibrates with the sound. And what is that we can do, we can perceive with all this complexity that we can perceive sounds. Let's see first the ear. The sound vibration in the air need to cross all the different parts of the ear, the external, middle, and internal ear, to arrive to the cochlea, where vibrations is converted in electrical impulses that can be read by the auditory nerve. In the external ear, the sound is funneling by the pinna in the external auditory canal and make vibrate the tympanic membrane, right? This vibration is transmitted in the middle ear, that is a cavity, a bone cavity inside the temporal bone. And this vibration in the tympanic membrane, it will be transmitted towards the inner ear by this change of ossicles, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, that they are the smallest, the tiniest ossicles in the body, and because of the angles of the joint and the displacement of the movement, just compress the sound and increase this sound from the tympanic membrane to the membrane of the oval window that is only 30 times smaller. In addition, the vibrations need to go from an interface between air and fluid. In the middle ear is an air cavity, whereas in the inner ear is a fluid cavity. In the inner ear, in the cochlea, there are 3 longitudinal chambers that receive the number of scala, scala media, scala vestibuli, and scala tympani. And in between this scala media and scala tympani, you have a key element that is the basilar membrane. The basilar membrane move up and down when the membrane of the oval window moves inwards and outwards. The key property of this basilar membrane is that it vibrates in specific regions depending on the frequency of the sound. And this creates the principle of tonotopy. What the basilar membrane does is just decompose a complex sound in all the different frequency components. And it moves up and down, more or less depending on the intensity. As you can see here in this demo with the Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. Sit on the basilar membrane, we have the organ of Corti. And in the organ of Corti, we have the cells that are translating this vibration, this up and down movement of the basilar membrane in electrical impulses. These cells have this small hair or stereocilia, and on top of this stereocilia, we have another membrane that is called the tectorial membrane, and all of these with the basilar membrane on the bottom and the tectorial membrane on the top, it works like a hinge joint. Then when the basilar membrane moves up, the tectorial membrane moves sideways, and this may displace, bend these stereocilia, these small hairs, and these open microscopic channels in the hair cells that let potassium ions enter into the cell and change the electrical potential of the cell. In addition to that, we have a protein in these cells that is called prestin that is able to contract and amplify this, as you can see in this demo here. Let's see now what the auditory nerve fibers are receiving. The depolarization at the level of the hair cells make the axons of the auditory nerve starting to have action potentials. And this is the message, this is the code that the brain will understand. This is a recording of the activity of one of these axons. And there is a property very important that is the phase locking. These axons are able to fire in synchrony with the particular waves. For example, in this case, 400 Hertz. Then this is the sound of the neurons in the brain, what you just heard. This information that is a code of action potentials that are happening in a given time is the code that the brain needs to interpret for you to enjoy music. In the auditory brain, we have a lot of different stations with different neurons that are processing further this pattern of action potentials. Let's summarize. This is the cochlea. Here we have the auditory nerve, and the first stage is the cochlear nucleus. In the cochlear nucleus, neurons are responding in different manner that it happens in the auditory nerve. For example, some neurons are only active when the sound arrives, and other neurons are active to specific frequencies, the principle of tonotropy that is happening along the auditory brain, and another neurons, for example, have a rhythmic pattern that is coping with the periodicity of the auditory signal. From the cochlear nucleus, the axons of cochlear nucleus neurons go to the second level, that is the superior olivary complex, where for the first time information from both ears converge in the same neuron. And this is very important to localize sound in space because these neurons are able to detect microsecond differences of arrival of the auditory signal on both ears or small differences in intensity. Signals converge later at the level of the inferior colliculus in the midbrain, and later on this information goes to the midbrain in the inferior colliculus, to the thalamus in the medial geniculate body, and the last stage will be in the auditory cortex in the temporal bone. Very important is the auditory thalamus, because this is the door that conveyed auditory information to the limbic system for the music to have a positive or negative balance and to add emotions, memory, etc., and enjoy the music. The auditory cortex is as well connected with higher centers from not only from the limbic system, but other higher associative centers in which cognition and memory will mix with the auditory information. I just put here only what is the auditory brain, but this is the beginning of the analysis of the auditory signal and multiple connections with different areas of the brain related with the limbic system, particularly for music, and with higher cognitive centers will have place. In humans, in the right hemisphere, is the processing mainly of music, whereas the left hemisphere is more devoted to the processing of speech. But as I say, the connectivity is complex and multiple in the brain. The problem with hearing is that it's not a sense that keep in the same way along your life. Then even if you are a very healthy person, when you become in the early 60 decade of your life, you're starting to losing hearing. And this is a condition that is called presbycusis. Presbycusis, it happens to all of us, but the problem with that is that you're starting to lose the high frequencies, and after the range goes to the medium one. If you can see a typical audiogram for a 60-year-old person, you will see that these are the frequencies that we tested, and this is around 0 is the normal hearing, and this implicate that you're having a hearing loss of different colors depending on the level. And you can see that the high frequencies are very impaired, but the medium and the low frequencies are very conserved. What this means is that music is less enjoyable because you lose the higher harmonics, whereas the fundamental frequency and the first harmonics are much kept. You can use hearing aids to solve that, but the hearing aids need to be very customized individually to cope with the particularly hearing loss that you have, because it's very frequency dependent, and they have to be customized when you become older. If the hearing loss is very profound, the only manner to cope with this is use cochlear implants. This is a schematic diagram about cochlear implants. They are a flexible electrode with multiple active points that is inserted in the cochlea and is stimulated, is sending electrical impulses to the auditory nerve, and this flexible electrode is connected with a receiver that is under the scalp that is receiving information from this emitter coil, and this emitter coil sends information that a speech processor fitting under your pinna capture with a microphone the signal from the environment, process these signals in impulses, in electrical impulses, and is transmitted all of this to the cochlea. How good is the hearing with cochlear implants? Cochlear implants, if are inserted in children before language acquisition, allowed normal language acquisition in these children. But the timing is very well conserved, but not the frequency. Let's hear this Croucher sonata by Beethoven. Beautiful. Let's see Beethoven with a profound hearing loss and cochlear implants. At the beginning, it looks very awful, but if you put attention into the signal, the timing is very well preserved, and the difference in energy are also preserved. But obviously, the spectral component, the color of this music, is unfortunately lost. The last condition that I would like to mention today is tinnitus. Tinnitus is a condition that is affecting about 360 million of people worldwide, and it sounds something like this. And this is sound constantly 24 hours a day, all day, and it doesn't have cure. In many occasions, this condition is related with hearing loss, and at the moment, it doesn't have any drug or any prevented treatment. I will stop my talk here, just summarizing the main points and the take-home message for you. And remember, your hearing sense, it has to last you your whole life. Protect your hearing and don't expose to loud noises. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sorry, I hadn't unmuted. Thank you, Victoria. That was really interesting. And I can see questions already coming in, but I have to hold back because we're going to hear two talks and then we're going to get some questions for you. The next talk is going to be from our second speaker, who's Professor Eric Clarke, who's the Heather Professor in the Faculty of Music here in Oxford and is a Professorial Fellow at Wadham College in Oxford. Professor Clarke will talk to us about the way in which music is to be understood, not just by attention to the brain, but by looking at the body and the environment in which we find ourselves. Professor Clarke.
Thanks very much, Anita, and for your introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers of this very interesting event for inviting me to take part. So, as we are all doing, I'm going to share my screen in a moment and talk to you about my topic. So, it's something of a truism that music engages people in powerful ways. When asked why they spend so much time with music, people invariably refer to the intensity of their musical experiences as the principal motivation. In a rather remarkable book entitled Strong Experiences with Music, the Swedish psychologist and musician Alf Gabrielsson documented the profound musical experiences that people had derived from more than 1,000 interviews with ordinary Swedish people of all ages. Now, these experiences take various forms and are organized by Gabrielsson in this fascinating book according to a whole range of categories. One of these categories is entitled Merging with the Music. And here is an example from that chapter. I will play the music to which it refers and invite you just to read the reminiscence that comes from this middle-aged man.
There's a lady who's sure all that glitters is gold, and she's buying a stairway to heaven. When she gets there, she knows if the stores are all closed, with a word she can get what she came for. Ooh, and she's buying a stairway to heaven.
So this man in his middle age, reminiscing to something back when he was a teenager or in his 20s perhaps, talks about this way in which he kind of his experience is so powerful that he feels that he is kind of almost identified with this music. And in case we think that this might just be a peculiarity of kind of middle-aged male rock fans, here is a rather similar kind of reminiscence from a middle-aged woman recalling hearing Beethoven's Third Piano Concerto again in her past. And I'll read it out. It felt, she says, it felt as if I sank all the deeper into a great and universal concentration. Then and there, every part of the music that reached my ears became a part of me. And the first and second movement as a whole, that was me just then. I was inside the music, and the music was inside me. It wasn't possible to distinguish one from the other. So these are really very extraordinarily kind of intense experiences, and they're the kinds of experiences that I'm sure many people in this audience can, to a greater or lesser extent, identify with. How then can we understand why it is that people have such profound experiences? We've already heard from Dr. Bajo the extraordinary way in which sound is processed by the auditory apparatus and finds its way into our brains. But why is it then that it kind of engages our experience in such powerful ways? Well, one way to do that might be to go back and think about the experience of our very early experience of hearing when we are still in the womb, in fact, and at the time around our own birth. If we look at prenatal audition, so the hearing that the fetus can hear, that the fetus has inside its mother's womb, it's known that the fetus, that the auditory system of the fetus is essentially more or less completely mature and operating by about halfway through pregnancy, by about 20 weeks of pregnancy. And that relatively soon after that, by about 24 weeks, the fetus is clearly responding to external sound, or to sounds that this auditory system is picking up in terms of its own movements. So this already gives us a clue that from several months before we are born, we're already hearing the sounds of the kind of broader auditory environment to which we are exposed. And that auditory environment, of course, is probably largely the voice of the mother who is carrying this fetus, as well as relatively loud external sounds. I mean, the wall of the woman's abdomen and the amniotic fluid in which the fetus is bathed attenuates the amount of sound that gets to the auditory system. And there have been some attempts to kind of record what the kind of sound is. And it sounds, as you could imagine, a bit like the sort of sounds that we hear underwater, rather muffled and with the kind of attacks of those sounds rather attenuated, but with clear pitch elements to it and a clear timing profile. So a psychologist and musicologist called Richard Parncutt has, in a very interesting series of articles, speculated about the ways in which these very early prenatal and perinatal, so around the time of birth as well, but prenatal auditory experiences may be one way to understand how it is that we acquire these powerful musical capacities that we have in adulthood. That it is the relationship between these prenatal sounds, the feeling of the mother's movement, and in fact, the tensing and relaxing of her own body as she responds to the sounds that she is either making or hearing around her, that in turn influence the as yet unborn child. It is as if the mother's own response to sound is kind of training her to be born infant in what those sound, in the kind of effect that those sounds might have on the infant's body and ultimately emotions. So if that's what is happening in kind of prenatal hearing, it's also worth remembering that the newborn human baby is, in a sense, a very premature animal. If you compare human capacities around the time of their birth with the capacities of animals like, sheep and horses and buffalo, humans are born in an incredibly vulnerable state. It takes a human baby a year roughly to become, more or less independently mobile, to acquire language, to start to gain some kind of independence and some degree of being able to act on its own. Whereas a sheep or a horse is up and running about within often minutes of being born. This kind of prematurity, if you like, of a newborn human infant, on the one hand, has some very serious disadvantages. Clearly, newborn human infants are extremely vulnerable and need a great deal of protection. But it comes also with some very interesting advantages. And that is that the human infant is necessarily incredibly tightly tied to the adults who are looking after it and the kind of sociability within which it is engaged. And it is this sociability and the human culture that allows human infants to do, or causes the human infants to develop the kind of communicative and sociable relationships that are absolutely central to human cognitive development. So this kind of prematurity, as I say, has the disadvantage of vulnerability, but the huge advantage of a kind of shaping and engagement with the rest of human culture. Now, a woman called Daisy Fancourt, who actually was a music student here in the Faculty of Music, she graduated probably about 10 years ago, she was at Christchurch, has done some extremely interesting work with the function of music in neonatal intensive care units, and also the function of music in the relationships between women and their newborn babies, and the capacity of music to help with postnatal depression. What she found was that music played in neonatal ICU units could have a really quite significant effect on the well-being of both the infants and the mothers by, first of all, in a quite straightforward way, helping to kind of mask or damp down the kind of mechanical sounds and the sounds of machines and so on that tend to be going on in ICUs, but also in providing the kind of soothing effect on newborn babies that it is known that music can have. And in the same sort of way, for mothers with sometimes premature babies who are necessarily more separated from their babies because their babies may be in incubators, that these mothers can be helped to establish a kind of communicative relationship with those young babies, and to overcome some of the kind of blockages in communication that can be closely associated with postnatal depression. So this way in which music can kind of be involved in helping to shape the relationship between infants and their carers is a kind of extension of the way in which the brain itself is at birth, in a sense, a very incomplete organ. It is in one way, of course, complete in that it is fully functioning, but it is incredibly open to the shaping effects of the environment into which it is born. And it is the way what neuroscientists call plasticity, the shaping of the enormous potential that is locked up in a newborn brain, the shaping of it by the environmental regularities around that organism, that human being, that give the brain its fantastically kind of adaptable and powerful relationship with the environment in which it operates. So what this suggests, or what this demonstrates perhaps, is the mutuality of organisms with their environments. That in order to understand music perception, we have to understand how it is that musical perceivers interact with their musical environments. In other words, a kind of particular kind of ecology, this mutuality between organisms and their environments. And this image is, although it's a long way away from music perception, one might say, an image which I think rather nicely illustrates that kind of shaping relationship between organisms and their environments. And I like it also because, although it's not really exact, this particular tree looks a little bit like a kind of cortex here with a cerebellum and a brain stem. So it has a kind of brainish look about it. But what this picture tells us is that here is an organism, a tree in this case, growing in an environment that has a very powerful shaping effect on it. In this case, the shaping effect is simply the wind that comes from one particular direction and has caused this organism to grow or be shaped in a very particular kind of way. And the shaping of that organism in turn has an effect back on the environment in which it is growing. This tree now casts shade on a particular patch of grass and perhaps allows that patch of grass to grow in a different way had it not been shaded by the tree. So the environment and the organism are in this incredibly close reciprocal relationship where the growing of one creates new opportunities in the other, and vice versa. They have this kind of cyclical relationship with one another. So turning from trees, let me ask us an apparently strange question. Should we regard organisms as being like blobs or threads? Here is an organism, a very rather familiar organism, that looks rather blob-like, a European robin sitting on a post. So this looks like an organism that has a very distinctly bounded kind of exterior. It's quite clear where the robin, it seems to be quite clear where the robin starts and stops, and it is, in a sense, a bit like a blob. But the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who has written in extremely interesting ways about creativity and about making in general, and actually who is a very rather accomplished amateur cellist, and he even credits his own cello in the acknowledgements to one of his books on creativity. Ingold has encouraged us to think what it might be like to think of organisms not like the blob that is this robin, but more like threads. And he writes as follows about fungi. I should mention that his father was a mycologist, someone who studies funguses, so there's clearly a parental influence here. He writes, what if we were to think of the person like the fungal mycelium, not as a blob, but as a bundle of lines or relations along which life is lived? And this, just to quickly remind you, is what fungal mycelia look like. Here are a number of fungal mycelia, and you can see that they constitute a series of incredibly fine threads that kind of work out into their environment and into one another in an extremely kind of ramified way, so that they're totally entangled with their own environment. In fact, it's very hard to distinguish what is environment from what is organism. And Ingold writes, what if we were to think of the person like the fungal mycelium? What if our ecology was of lines rather than of blobs? What then might we mean by environment? He says, people, after all, don't live inside their bodies. Their trails are laid out in the ground, in footprints, paths, and tracks, and their breaths mingle in the air. So what I think he's trying to get at with this final, rather kind of poetic line about breaths mingling in the air is that that organisms interact with their environments in these incredibly ramified ways, and it is actually a kind of complete entanglement of the one with the other that we should be thinking about when we think about organisms. And similarly, one might say, here the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, back in the middle of the 20th century, writes about the way in which human beings and their tools can also have this incredibly sort of entangled relationship. He writes, the blind man's stick has ceased to be an object for him and is no longer perceived for itself. Its point has become an area of sensitivity, extending the scope and active radius of touch. If we want to get used to a stick, if I want to get used to a stick, I try it by touching a few things with it, and eventually I have it well in hand. I can see, notice that Merleau-Ponty uses the word see, I can see what things are within reach or out of reach of my stick. And this is very similar to that, for any of you in the audience who are string players, is extremely similar to the feeling of bow on string for a violinist or a cellist or a violist. It's that feeling that even though what a person is holding in their hand is a kind of stick and some horsehair, that you can actually feel that relationship between the horsehair and the string, even though there are, of course, no nerve fibers in either the stick or the horsehair or the string itself. And this is an example of a kind of philosophical or a kind of movement in cognitive science and philosophy in which a whole series of writers have talked about the ways in which we have to think about the mind as being extended beyond the bounds of the body into the environment, which we inevitably use as a kind of technology for ourselves. So this is something that the sociologist Tia Denora has taken up in a very interesting book called Music in Everyday Life, in which she writes how music itself can constitute a kind of extension of our mental capacities. She writes, viewed from the perspective of how music is used to regulate and constitute the self, these solitary and individualistic practices that we associate with music may be understood as part of a fundamentally social process of self-structuration, the constitution and maintenance of self. In this sense, the ostensibly private sphere of music use is part and parcel of the cultural constitution of subjectivity, part of how individuals are involved in constituting themselves as social agents. And we can think about this in both very solitary and very communal ways. There are ways in which we interact with music, as shown by the man in headphones or the woman playing the violin, apparently on her own, in which we engage with music in incredibly solitary, very kind of private ways, and similarly, ways in which we engage, as shown by this rather nice women's brass and reed band in Wisconsin from the early part of the 20th century, or from the Glastonbury crowd that's below it, ways in which we engage with music in massively social kinds of ways, both making it and, if you like, consuming it in those ways. So to kind of draw to the end, I'm going to move to the other end of life and just point out, as has already been mentioned, that music is one of the most persisting aspects of memory, even in people with severe kind of mental with mental injuries, and also in Alzheimer's disease. Musical memories are some of the last and most profoundly retained things that we have. There was a very fascinating program about 20 years ago about a man called Clive Waring, a very accomplished musician who, as a result of a brain injury, lost most of his memory, but retained all of his capacity for musical memories. And similarly, as has already been mentioned, people with Alzheimer's disease often retain a really remarkable ability to be kind of almost brought back to life, you might say, by the music in which they engaged. A very interesting organization called Turtle Key Arts has worked with some of our own music students here in the Jacqueline Dupre building in St. Hilda's on a project in which people with Alzheimer's will create and sing their own songs and are often extraordinarily animated by that process, just as Oliver Sacks has illustrated this in a YouTube video that you can watch with a man in a care home called Henry, and the way he's brought to life by music. And finally then, what should we think about the oft-cited phrase, the power of music, or music as a universal language? And I think here I would end by simply noting an element of caution. It is extraordinary what music can do for people and with people, but I think we have to be very careful in thinking about whether this is some kind of magical power of music. I don't think this is a power of music. I think this is about a relationship between people's musical capacities and the music within which they engage. And similarly, whilst we might fondly wish to believe that music was a universal language, you only have to play, you know, opera to rap fans or rap to opera fans to discover just how much music may not be understood by people who have very different kinds of musical sensitivities. So with that, I will stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. That was wonderful. Now we have questions streaming in, and we only have about 15 minutes for them at this point. So I'm going to choose a few, and just to start us off, and take us back to Victoria. We had two questions, Victoria. One was, what can we do to prevent hearing loss and or tinnitus? And then I thought, well, you actually did say towards the end, don't listen to such loud music. So I want to combine that with another question, which is, how badly can listening to loud music or headphones damage hearing?
Well, damage badly. And I think that you should protect yourself for noise all your life. I think that you should wear protection when the sound is very loud, especially if musicians that, you know, the tragedy of that usually hearing loss and tinnitus impact more frequently in musicians because of the exposure of sounds of high intensity. For example, people who play trumpets without protection, or being in an orchestra without protection, and the continuous use of headphones for hearing music in normal life is not a very positive thing, because you accumulate noise overexposure throughout your life. And then presbyacusis is something that happened to you sooner or later. The thing is, if you are less exposed to noise or to loud sounds, you will take it when you are older. Then protection is the key. And the other thing that I would like to recommend, if you go to the optician at least once a year when you are a child, and one every 2 years when you are an adult, how many people do the same with the hearing? Then if you protect your hearing all your life, and when you are having a hearing loss, you immediately fit hearing aids that are customized for you, you will be in better position to have a better life, better quality of life, and prevent for further hearing loss and prevent for tinnitus.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And I'm going to sort of transition to an interesting question that sort of comes along with this to Eric. How has technology affected the way in which we respond to music?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I think the first thing is to say that we have to be careful about the word technology. Technology is not just, electronic technology, as it were. We can think of musical instruments and, in fact, ways of writing music as very important kinds of musical technologies. And those things have profoundly affected the ways in which people can engage with music. I mean, music writing, for instance, made all kinds of ways in which music can be created, the ways in which music can be composed, of course, extremely, radically changed the ways in which we could conceive of large spans of music and the ways in which different kinds of music might be, or different kinds of musical parts might be combined. But thinking more into more recent musical technologies, I think recording, the advent of recording technologies at the very end of the 19th century and the domination of our lives now by various kinds of recording technologies have had very interesting effects on our response to music. They have, in a sense, of course, democratized music. They allow very, very vastly more people to have access to vastly more music than has ever been the case in the whole of human history. Some people have argued that this has kind of, in a sense, devalued music, that because music is constantly available, that we have a less profound kind of response to it. I'm not sure I believe that, actually. I think the evidence is that people can have tremendously powerful responses still to music, however they come across it, whether it is live or recorded. And of course, there are whole genres of music whose existence is tied up with that technology itself. But it has certainly done one thing, which is to change the kind of multimodal or multisensorial nature of music. Until the advent of recording technologies, the only way in which you could encounter music was when either you made it yourself or some other human being or human beings around you made it in your physical presence. But now, of course, we can carry music with us wherever we are, or go to sleep with it on headphones in our own beds and all that kind of stuff. So we can, in a sense, isolate the purely sonic part of music from that multimodal or multisensorial quality of music, where we see and hear and perhaps even feel music being made around us. And that, I think, has interesting both positive and negative consequences. In a sense, it allows us to contemplate music in a way that arguably is rather different from music encountered in that kind of physical reality, but it also deprives it of some of that multimodal richness that live music has.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to Victoria with a slightly technical question, which is beyond me, but here you go. It's what experiments demonstrated the movement of the basilar membrane?
Yes. Well, it was Hungarian scientists in the 19th century who demonstrate that the principle of tonotropy. The name is von Veckersy. And von Veckersy demonstrate what he did. It was a very nice experiment. He took off the temporal bone. He isolated the cochlea for human cadavers, and then the basilar membrane is like a diving thing that is very rigid in the base of the cochlea and is very wide and flexible towards the end. What he did, it was putting silver flakes along this transparent membrane and take pictures when he moved the membrane to specific frequencies. Then he demonstrates that particular areas in the basilar membrane are mostly vibrating, as are mostly moving up and down, depending on the frequency of the sound. This was the experiment. That it was, I think it was quite clever. And he got the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1961.
Right, thank you. I'm going to go back to Eric. This is interesting. In what ways do you think the communal and social experience of music is very different to the solitary experience of it?
Yeah, great question. Just to get into that, I don't know how many people listening or watching will have read Thomas Mann's great novel, The Magic Mountain. This is a novel written in the 1940s, but about a tuberculosis sanatorium in the early part of the 20th century, when the gramophone had first been invented. And there is a scene in this great novel in which a gramophone is brought into the sanatorium to kind of entertain the patients there. And they all crowd around it like it is a concert and listen to a record together. In this very kind of collective and social way, and they do things like applauding the record when it comes to an end. So they have a response to music, which is a very kind of social and communal one. But at the end of this kind of demonstration of the record, the central character in the novel, a man called Hans Castorp, gets hold of the gramophone and takes it to his room and takes with it these extraordinary flat objects, which are just records, which he puts on the gramophone and listens to them on his own. And Thomas Mann gives us a really interesting kind of insight into the different kinds of experience. He presents Hans Castorp's experience of listening to this music completely on his own. To be able to listen to music without any musicians being present, of course, was a completely new phenomenon. And he presents this as being extremely intense, almost kind of sexually charged, you might say, kind of experience in which Castorp and these records have a kind of, a nighttime session together, and in which he enters into this musical material in a particularly profound way, and actually in a way that he presents as being more significant and more, and in a sense deeper than what he describes as being the rather superficial relationship of the other patients when they sat around listening to the gramophone. So I think it can work both ways. I think that kind of solitary relationship with music, when a person really kind of loses themselves in music. If we think back again to the examples that I gave at the beginning of my talk of the man listening to Led Zeppelin or the woman listening to the Beethoven Piano Concerto, that kind of solitary and very highly individual relationship with a piece of music can be an extremely powerful thing. But we all know also how tremendously powerful it can be to sit in a concert hall with other people who are listening very intently, or to be, clubbing with people who are, taken over by music and dancing, or to be in a Glastonbury crowd kind of thing, listening to a band play on a stage with, 10,000 other people. That also, there is a kind of contagion, you might say, in the excitement of people in that crowd that can be very powerful as well.
Okay, now before we have a break, I think we have time for one more, and this is one that possibly either or both of you can have a quick word on, and it's from a colleague of yours, Eric, at the University of Surrey, and he writes, "I am deeply interested in rhythmic prediction and experience. What do we know about how humans process, make sense, and respond to macro and micro rhythmic events?"
Okay.
Either of you.
I can say very rapidly that you can entrain neurons. If the neurons can change the frequency at which they are tuned, and if you make a rhythm, the neurons are could follow the rhythm, and you can entrain the activity of the brain with a rhythm.
Great, and in a rather similar way, I would say at a kind of more behavioral level, not just as well as at this neurophysiological level, at a behavioral level, there is a huge amount of evidence that people's bodily movements can also be entrained by the rhythms of of music. Actually, again, from a kind of more medical point of view, people suffering from Parkinson's disease who have considerable difficulty in organizing their movements, in initiating their movements, again, remarkable work showing that a person who is completely stuck and frozen and unable to start walking, if you play music, either marching music or dancing music, they will be kind of pushed into life, if you like, by the entraining effect of that external rhythmic activity that kind of helps them to start moving. There's been some very influential work done, again, in a kind of in the crossover area between psychology and philosophy by a number of people writing about what is called predictive coding. And this is the ways in which, again, across a kind of neuroscientific as well as behavioral level, there is a great deal of evidence that what we're doing is a kind of complex business of projecting into the future the whole time and relating our own internal projections with the external realities of rhythmic sounds.
Excellent. Great question for both of you. So thank you very much for all those really excellent questions and excellent replies. And I'm now going to say, we'll take a break. And at 6:10 exactly, I'm going to start because I'd like to get back to the philosopher. Please don't go away because the philosophy is still to come, and then we'll have lots more questions. So have a quick cup of tea, make a quick cup of tea, and I'll see you back at 6:10. Thank you. Hello, welcome back. I hope I'm welcoming you all back. So for our final speaker this evening, we have the philosopher, Professor Nick Zangwill, who is Honorary Research Fellow at University College London and visiting professor at the University of Lincoln. He's going to talk to us this evening about, among other things, the relationship between music and beauty. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you so much, Anita. And yeah, thank you for the whole event. It's fascinating. Let me share my screen. And kick off with my slideshow. Okay. Right. So I'm going to give an outline of a view of music which comes from Hans Slick, the 19th century critic who wrote a book called On the Beautiful in Music. And I'm going to proceed, though, in doing this by running through some theories of running through some theories that connect music with emotion. And I'll briefly run through these and some of the main problems with them. But I also want to discuss some of the more methodological issues about how we can think about music from a common sense and philosophical point of view in its relation to the empirical sciences. I want to think about how that works and how it sometimes it works in one way I think it doesn't work, and another way I think it can work. And then I want to say some more about this beauty-based view of music. And what's
Nick, can I just stop you for a minute? There's a little bit of crackling.
Yeah, I'm not getting the same. It doesn't sound quite like it did.
Yeah.
Before. Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't sound quite as good as it did in the trial somehow.
That's a little bit better. Try not to move around because it may disturb something when you move your hands, okay?
How is that?
It sounds okay. It's due to the mic brushing against your shirt.
Okay, how is that?
Watch that, okay?
Oh, how is that?
Keep it away from your shirt.
Okay. I got it. Okay. So do interrupt me again if there's a sound problem.
Okay.
Okay, so here's Hans Slick. Here's the guy I very much like. And I think he's very much relevant today still. So here's I'm just going to run through this idea that music is somehow internally connected with emotion. And he's very skeptical of that, as am I as well. This is his book from 1854. He was actually a music critic, but he was well versed in virtually every field at his time. He's from Vienna, not Germany, which is sort of important because he was in that kind of science-friendly intellectual tradition. And that's a recent translation, which I very much recommend. Of course, there are some connections no one could deny. So there are these external connections between music and various emotions. They can remind you of them, but no one would think that was very interesting because it's just a coincidental or contingent that that song reminds you of that. You can have very gentle music, which is very soothing. You might describe it in a way which you play at very loud volume, which would make your neighbors extremely angry. Right, so there are these kind of connections. There seems to be no internal connect. There are those kind of relations between music and emotion. And I think that what that shows is that you've got to get rid of those sort of coincidental, irrelevant things and think of music as a kind of artifact that's it's a kind of, it's like not all artifacts are objects, some of them are events. And so music has a certain purpose of doing a certain thing. And that's what you need to think about when we're thinking in general terms about music. What is its functional purpose? And according to emotion theorists, of whom there are a lot, that there's some kind of internal, it's some kind of production of emotion that's important, or a more common theory. I mean, I hate the cliche of sad music. It's but let's go with it anyway. It's some kind of imagining sadness or representing it to yourself. And that's a very common theory. And I can think of many people, like Kendall Walton in philosophy, Jerry Levison, Roger Scruton. It's a very common theory to hold this, that music makes us imagine emotion. So why are people attracted to theorizing music in terms of emotion? And one thing is that there are these, we often describe music in terms of emotion. I think this doesn't take you that far. I mean, because they might well be metaphorical. So we often describe music in terms of the weather, or in, which is obviously metaphorical. So you can describe music as stormy, but no one would think there's anything, you know, rainy or stormy happening in the music. So why are they so literal then about the emotion descriptions if they're so unliteral about these other obviously metaphorical descriptions? So let's get rid of that. Phenomenology. We seem to sometimes we feel that we're moved by the music. Sure, but say very sad, grief-ridden music. Is it? We describe it in those ways, but is this more like? This is a person undergoing grief? But this is more like what someone looks like when they're listening to music, which is has that kind of power. They don't have that outward expression. So it seems like it's not the same kind of, if it is emotion, it's not the same kind of emotion that's going on when people literally feel those emotions quite literally. So I think it's really not clear that that's that much in common between feeling grief and the mindset of a musical listener or maker who's making music, which you'd want to describe in those terms. Yeah, it's just if you want to do some hard science, travel on the London Underground, and look at people listening to music. They're listening to music with all sorts of different emotional colors, as you might describe it, but actually their faces are all pretty similar. They're not reacting in various different ways. So I think that shows it's not really literally emotion that they're feeling in that sense, although it may be a generic pleasure in the beauty, as Hanslick thinks. Going in the other direction, there's this problem of negative emotion. Look, we love listening to grief-ridden, very sad music, but are we crazy? Are you crazy? Why do you want to listen? Why do you want to be? Do you want to feel sad? Do you want to imagine being miserable? No. So if you take it very literally, it would make it completely irrational and unreasonable to listen to that kind of music. So there are sort of replies to that, but not very convincing in my view. And so I think we do better to focus on the more purist kind of view that you find in Hanslick, that the point of music, or the kind of artifact it is geared to enjoyment of the musical beauty. And it's going to be quite a general theory, because there seems to be some such pleasure across cultures, across eras. And if you say to me, oh, there's some avant-garde weird music, I mean, I just don't care, because it doesn't have to be a completely universal theory. It can be one which applies to many kinds, and that's all that's important. Now, saying something like that does concede that there's an internal musical emotions. You can be surprised that something happens in the music, right? Well, that's okay on this purist musical beauty view. But I want to now step back and really try and connect up with my co-discussants and think about how we're to think about the status of the issue, right? Is it a sort of very philosophical issue, a very abstract issue? We think in a pure way, and in what sense could the sciences help us reflect on the nature and essence of music and musical experience? And I think it's not so easy to throw disciplines together. I think it takes a lot of hard work, although everyone's busy being interdisciplinary. I think it's not enough just to throw the two subjects and juggle them. You need to build a kind of bridge between them. Yes, music's a real phenomenon, and you should be able to study it in an empirical, scientific way. There's people producing it and people consuming it, but how you do that is actually a bit nuanced. So I'm going to start off with a way not to go. And then I'll say some ways to go. So here's a very prominent person who's written on music and emotion with a whole sort of handbook he's edited with lots of people commenting on the issue. The problem is with this genre of empirical inquiry into the nature of music is that it's based on questionnaires. So, you know, this is science, but what they do is they'll say, play some music and then say, well, which of these 5 emotions or which of these 7 emotions did you feel? And then you have to tick one of those boxes. Well, and there's a lot of that. A lot of this research does take that form. And then sometimes they even throw in some brain imagery, but it's always has to fit back to those questionnaires and what they recorded on the questionnaires at the time. Well, right. This is a guy who's making an awful lot of money selling homeopathic medicine, right? And if you look at how the real, real medical research shows it's pretty worthless as a cure, but when you do proper double-blind research, it has the actual, apart from a placebo, it has actually no effect whatsoever. But if you do questionnaire research on it, and you say, how do people feel, and do they feel like it's made them better, then they present their results, the homeopathists present their results as actually as a kind of scientific vindication. But it's just bad science, as Ben Goldacre would say, because it's not properly double-blind. And I think the same's true of those questionnaire research into music. There's no discipline in how they select what the things are that you can choose. You can't say none of the above or are you crazy? Why didn't they have weather patterns, or why didn't they have colors associated? You know, we're supposed to say the music reminded me of this color. But so there's little discipline in thinking about the probe in that kind of science. And I'd very much recommend this book by Brian Hughes, who's critiquing a much questionnaire-based psychology. Incidentally, he just wrote a book, which I haven't read, The Psychology of Brexit, which I'd really like to read. I just saw that on his website. And this is someone else who's critiqued that whole genre of research. Now, here's a way, some research I do think is good. This is Rory Allen from Goldsmiths. And he's interested in, if I can use the word, autistic spectrum phenomena. And the understanding of autism has changed a lot in the last 20, 25 years, but there's still a kind of consensus that there's a shortfall in those on the spectrum in understanding and imagining emotion, right? Well, if that's true, it has an immediate consequence for listening to music, because it should be the case that people on an autistic spectrum do not appreciate music in the same way as those as typically developing people, if music is primarily about imagining or understanding emotions, that we sort of project a personae of a certain emotion into the music. Right, but then if you hook up both kinds of listeners with galvanic skin response tests, you find that there's actually no difference between the spectrum group and the typically developing group, which there should be if musical understanding and listening is linked in, is to do with imagining emotions, as those people say. So I think that gives you a result there. That is a way you can get empirically to across that bridge to tell you something about these general theories of emotion. Let's see how I'm doing for time. I'm doing okay. Okay, so there isn't a difference according to these emotion theories of music, there should be a great difference between autistic and typically developing groups. There isn't. According to Rory Allen, and that shows really, I think there's something wrong with that theory of music. It's a negative conclusion about those theories. And that fits in with the fact that so much music therapy works well with people on the spectrum, because they don't feel the stress that they feel when they have to think in terms of understanding others' emotions, which normally causes stress. And there are some great autistic spectrum musicians. Okay, so Hanslick has this pleasure theory, and this good thing about this theory, a big thing in its favor, is that it makes it reasonable to pursue it, because the pursuit of pleasure is very reasonable. And Hanslick himself is really concerned with both what music is and what good musical listening is, where you're following a theme. And he doesn't in fact deny that we are affected by the physicality of music in the sensations of it, and doesn't deny that we have emotions, but that's a bad kind of listening. Slouched in their chairs, these enthusiasts allow themselves to brood and sway in response to vibrations of tones instead of contemplating tones attentively. So he has a view really about what music, not just what it is, but what it should be. And there's a rather extraordinary bit where he talks about it in terms of Italians. I can't see it on my screen at the moment. The tuneful tyranny of the treble or something, it's off my screen, is a main cause of the intellectual, it's among Italians. They listen to this, they have a certain kind, I can't see it on my screen now. The intellectual complacency of the Italians, for whom intellectual penetration is unattainable, whereas the Northerner, this is written in 1854, the Northerner loves to follow an artistic network of harmonic and contrapuntal complexities. Consequently, the enjoyment is easier for these listeners whose intellectual activity is minimal, and such music drunkards can consume masses of this music, which the artistic intellect shudders. This is quite incredible. So here's an Italian. I just my sister-in-law was Italian, but it's it really has an extraordinary view that there are ways in which you should listen. So I think think about the music and then think about the mind. For the music, there's got a sonic physical basis, and then there's the tones in the music, which are the basis for musical beauty. Then think about the mind. There's two kinds of reactions to music. There's what he calls pathological reactions, where we're just emotionally swayed by the physical impact. And then there's attentive listening with the higher faculties of imagination and Geist. Musical listening is aesthetic, pleasure in musical beauties, contemplation of the tones and their combinations. Whereas pathological listening is passive, physical stimulation, mere effect on the nervous system. So the musical listening is what philosophers call, has got intentionality. It's directed onto the tonal structure, the specific one, not an aimless causing of emotional disturbances, which is disconnected from our higher faculties of willing and thinking. So this has some relevance to the role of physiology. And here's a quote from Hanslick, and who was quite versed in the psychology of his day and studied with Vischer. What physiology has to offer the science of music is of utmost importance for our comprehension of the auditory impressions as such, but not as music. So he's sort of claiming that, of course, musical listening, proper musical listening depends on all that being in place, on the physicality of the music and the physicality of its input. But that doesn't get you that far in understanding the music as such. So if you think that there's an explanatory relation there between B and C, the physicality of the music and the pathological reaction, but that's not going to tell you much about the higher faculties of mind, C, which are directed on to A, the tones and the musical beauty. Now, I'm going to skip a lot of material here, so I can, because about the generality of that theory, because I'm watching the clock and I'm watching Anita watching me watch the clock. So I'm going to skip over the problems of the sublime in music, some ABBA and easy pop music, and whether that really fits into the theory. There's a sublime pizza there. So I'm just going to wind up there, but I think this Hanslick had a lot of things right to emphasize beauty in our experience of beauty and experience of music, and the way that in music we have this intentional focus, not just on the physicality of music, but on the structures of tones which are set up by that, and the musical beauty residing in those higher level structures in the music which is out there. And it's although there needs to be the physical input, it's It's, if you like, the faculties of mind at work are quite sophisticated, and I'd call them higher mental or cognitive faculties, whereby we're understanding the music as such. So I think he gets a lot of right about that, and I think above all, he explains why we're not crazy to be so crazy about music, for it to be such a big part of our lives, because it has a value. There's a value which we're experiencing and which gives us great pleasure. So this is my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Sorry, can you hear me? Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Well, we've got quite a few questions. I'm going to start with one. Nick, I think you might be able to answer this, but if anybody else wants to come in, just indicate. It's someone who asks us, please tell us about Indian Carnatic music, thousands of years old, the importance of the mantras and effect on humans. How do mantras affect the brain? So there's both the brain, but also in connection, I think, with what you were saying, Nick. It would be interesting to hear. Do you have anything to say about this, Indian? Oh, Nick, we can't hear you. You're. Yeah.
I mean, you also, there's a lot of music which is trance involving. The whirling dervishes will do that as well. A lot of music has that function, and of course that's right. Hanslick would say, he would, in his slightly Germanic he would say, it's true, it happens, and that would be in effect running from along the bottom of my screen, but it is a different kind of musical listening, one which gets you into a trance but doesn't involve those intellectual faculties, whereby we follow a theme and see these and concentrate on the structures of the tones. We all use music to manage our moods and to achieve those kinds of ends. Of course, it can do that. There's shopping music to make us spend more, etc., etc. But that is not all music can be.
Do either of the other two speakers want to say anything about this?
Well, in my opinion, it relates as well very well with what we say previously about entrainment. Music, the rhythm in music is able to entrain our neurons and to entrain our body, as Eric commented before. Then this entrainment, if the rhythm is the proper one, it could entrain a different state in the brain, in the oscillation, in the global electrical activity in the brain. And this can have an effect of relaxing or an effect of putting us in a specific mood, in the same manner that, dissonance or lack of harmonicity, it could put us in another state of mind, if you like.
Thank you.
I mean, if I could just add something to it. I think what a question like that really illustrates is that I think we have to be extremely cautious about about the kinds of reductionism that threaten at every corner. I think it would be crazy to think that we could explain any musical tradition only in physiological terms. And I think it would be crazy equally to suggest that any music does not have any physiological components. I mean, it's quite clear that if we're having any kind of experience at all, the brain is going to be active. So that there is a neuroscience to everything that we can possibly experience, and yet neuroscience can't possibly explain every aspect of those things that we do experience. And I think we have to recognize, in the case of Carnatic music, the incredibly long, very complex cultural tradition to which that music belongs, and that the experiences that people have when they are involved in that music as producers of that music or listeners to that music or people involved in any aspect of that music's cultural manifestation is going to be an incredibly complex combination of fact that, you know, that they're not going to be able to detect that music is even going on unless they have a brain, if you see what I mean. But on the other hand, that is going to be a tiny part of a very rich experience, which is a product of their own individual, you know, autobiographies, their life experiences, and their engagement in a culture which comes with its own set of values and norms and ways of experiencing. So I think that one has to look for extremely multi-leveled explanations of very complex cultural phenomena.
Interesting. I have two questions which relate to this one, and I'm going to follow them up one at a time. The first is relating to the cultural side, and it's again to any of you. Are there properties of music that are found in all musical cultures?
Well, can I come in?
Sure, yeah.
Well, I think that's one of Hanslick's strengths, because he will pick on the beauty in music as something you find in many cultures, many if not all, while the particular expression of that, the way it's combined with different other things, because music is combined with different things in different cultural contexts, can vary wildly. But what Hanslick will say, I would say on his behalf, is that where music does something else, as it, you know, works with military music or in different cultures for different nationalistic aims or different ways music can function in different ways, it always does that only because it also does the Hanslickian thing of there being some pleasure which we can partake in listening to the music in a much purer way. So it can do all these impure things and all these various things that it does, but it only because it does this purely musical thing. So it can be impure only because it's pure. It can be engaged in all that variety because it is has this one constant. So Hanslick gives you quite a universal aspect to the plurality which we actually find when music is combined with all sorts of different things.
Interesting. That leads to the other question, which picks up this strand. Are there good explanations of why there seem to be so many individual differences, both in musical ability and in musical preferences, even within a culture?
Well, can I say something about that?
Please.
I mean, I think it's back to, you could take it back to what I was saying about shaping and about the way in which organisms are shaped by their environments. You know, as I mentioned before, the brain is the most flexible, the most plastic, the most changeable organ in the human body, arguably. It is, as it were, kind of nothing and everything at some point in early embryonic development. And as it is exposed to its environment in all its complexity and over the lifespan of an individual, it grows to become a very individual brain. So in some ways, because we all have absolutely unique life histories and unique experiences, it's not surprising that we have highly individual tastes, both in regards to music and in regard to almost anything you ask people about. You know, some people like Marmite, some people hate Marmite, to take a very classic and crude example. But that, you know, people have tremendously different experiences and therefore tremendously different tastes. But at the same time, I think it would be wrong to suggest that this is completely relativistic and completely arbitrary. There are also considerable commonalities in human experience and in human culture. First of all, you know, to take an example that might relate to some of the underlying things that might be common to many musical styles and many musical preferences. Human beings are bipedal organisms. They have 2 legs and 2 arms. And so when they walk in a gravitational field, which is what our experience of the world is like, they walk in a 1-2-1-2 fashion. If we were tripedal organisms, and we had 3 legs, and we walked in a 1-2-3, 1-2-3 fashion, then you might find that kind of triple rhythms were, you know, the most widely found rhythms in the world. But the reality is that actually various versions of duple rhythm are by far the most common kinds of rhythmic patterns found throughout the world of music. So there is a very crude and very simple example about how a common factor that is true across humanity has an influence on the kinds of musical style features that we find, and in that sense, probably some kind of influence on what people find familiar about music. Now, when they find some music as being familiar, that doesn't necessarily mean they like it. If they've been exposed to a lot of very familiar music, actually, they start to find it very dull and they get very little pleasure from it. And I would say I would ask kind of Nick in a way here, given that pleasure is something that you ended up with your talk as saying that Hanslick took pleasure in, if you like, don't you regard pleasure, is pleasure an emotion?
Can I speak to that?
Yes, that was for you.
This is great. It's a feeling, but it's not like many of the other emotions. It's a different kind of emotion. It's a pleasure. The pleasure you take in music is in that sound structure. Whereas if you're feeling fear or anger, it's a kind of completely different kind of emotion. You could call it an emotion if you like, but it's certainly an intentional feeling. But it's pleasure directed on the music, and I think that's why you were so right to cite those people who sort of seem to disappear into the music, because the whole point, I think that I totally agree with that. I think Hanslick would as well, because that's the idea that the intentionality of your experience is focused completely and totally on the music, and you're not being distracted, and it's not background music, and that's tremendously important, because it's that is what you are hearing, and that is what you are taking pleasure in. Now so if that's when we're describing that in emotional terms, that's completely different from what's going on when we're angry, we're jealous, or we're feeling pride or something like that. So if it is of emotion, it's a completely different kind.
Can I ask a question that's just come in that I think is related to this? Has this been studied physiologically? I think this being what you're talking about, Nick. It's an interesting intersection of listeners seeking both pleasure and pain in the same experience too. This is somebody who's got a background in music. So has this been physiologically studied, what you're talking about?
Not that much. I mean, this guy Rory Allen has done a lot of research on listening, and they tend to go with galvanic skin response, which measures sort of it wouldn't really distinguish. It just shows you're reacting physiologically. It wouldn't necessarily distinguish the pain aspect. I mean, I'm very skeptical about I skipped a bit on the sublime, that the idea there is pain in listening to music, because people, when they play, Beethoven's Ninth, the angry bits, they're not, contrary to Susan McClary, they don't run out of the theatre. They stay to the end. They enjoy listening to that rather tortured, angry, sublime music. So I don't really believe that much music is that painful to listen to. I mean, it can be rough, it can be unpretty, it can have rough edges, like a screaming guitar solo or some of the angry Beethoven or something like that, but it's not painful at all. It's pleasurable. So I'm slightly a skeptic about pain in music.
On the pleasure side, I just mentioned this, that I had a great DPhil student a few years ago called Maria Vitek, who is now in the music department at the University of Birmingham, and she was interested in the relationship between rhythm, dance, and pleasure. Many people find it extremely pleasurable to dance to music. I mean, whether that is kind of ballroom dancing or club dancing, but particularly club dancing, actually. And what she was interested in was, what is it about the rhythmic structures of music, first of all, that make people feel compelled to dance, and secondly, what might be going on in their bodies or brains that might explain why they feel that it is pleasurable. And she did a great piece of work in which she got people to dance to freely dance to rhythmic structures that she played to them, and also scanned their brains while they were listening to that same music. And she found that the music that they found most compelling to dance to, which actually had a moderate level of rhythmic complexity, defined in a particular kind of way, the complexity, but a moderate level of musical complexity, rhythmic complexity, sorry, was music that they felt compelled to dance to. And it was that music that stimulated particular parts of the brain that are known to be pleasure centers. There's another person in Oxford called Morten Kringelbach, does a lot of work on the neurophysiology of pleasure. So this is pleasure that could be brought about by, you know, food or sex or music or drugs, since there are parts of the brain that are equally active with all of those kinds of activities. And what Maria Wittek found was that this moderately complex music that caused people to want to dance was also music that caused the pleasure centers in the brain to be particularly active. So I think there is a relationship there, and I'm sure, as Victoria was saying earlier, that it is very closely tied up with this kind of entraining effect that rhythm can have on the human nervous system.
I would like to add to what you just said, that you can evoke in an animal model, not in humans as well, you can evoke a fear conditioning with a sound. If you associate one stimulus that is not having any balance, positive or negative, as can be a neutral auditory stimulus, with an stimulus that create a fear conditioning. And after that, you only need to play the sound to create this. These associative memories are the basis for us to learn new things. Then if this, of course, is much more complex than that, but what I'm saying is that the evoke of pleasure or sadness in music is something that you learn, and you learn in your family, and you learn individually, and you learn in your own culture. Then it's something that is very individual, but at the same time is possible to do this in a rodent, for example, in an animal, in the laboratory, in an animal model. It's very easy to create fear conditioning with just a simple sound.
Could I also add something?
Sure.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I mean, the dancing, the relation between music and dance is fascinating, and I agree with what my two other co-speakers say, but I would want to add Geist back in there as well. I mean, I should confess that I'm a keen tango dancer. Not that great, but I liked it. Before lockdown, I did a lot, maybe once a week. And dance is also a form of understanding. So I agree with the physiological story you tell and talk about entrainment. Yes, that's part of it. Without that, there wouldn't be dance. But dance also realizes the understanding someone has with the music. When you dance to a piece of music, you can decide, am I going to now go with the rhythm, or am I going to go with the tune? There's a million choices you make. And if you watch people dancing, you can see how that some people might be just misunderstanding the music. You can tell by watching them dance how they're understanding it, or the wonderful way they're interpreting it by watching a really fantastic Buenos Aires tango dancer. Wow, you can see, gosh, you can see the understanding they've got. So I just want to say to my co-speakers, you're right, I totally agree with you, but let's also have the dimension of musical understanding, which Hanslick would call Geist, in the picture as well.
Can I just come back once more? Sorry, I don't want to hog it, but I very much agree with you, Nick. But I think what it raises is a really interesting. I mean, that kind of embodied understanding that you talk about can, I think, be thought of in two different ways. One is that, as it were, the understanding precedes the embodiment. That a person has a kind of rational understanding of what's going on, and then, as it were, directs the body to express that understanding. But the other way around, which many people have also argued, is that the body itself is a kind of, as it were, an organ of understanding, and that from what we find ourselves doing with our bodies, we achieve and manifest a kind of understanding. So I think it's at least worth considering. I think you and I would probably somewhat disagree, but in a, I'm sure, very respectful way, about which direction, or at least about the possibility of the reciprocity of that relationship between body and understanding.
Absolutely, that is the question.
Okay, and we'll move on to another question then. I think this is also going to be for Nick, but anybody can come in. Does Hanslink have any remarks on how active listening to music can enhance musical development or cognitive development in general? Or how pathological listening can have negative effects?
I know the book pretty well. I don't know his critical corpus, which is almost all in German. Not much to say about it. I think I'd certainly pick up on your comments, Anita, in the introduction. I mean, he's sort of with Plato in a way, that the way you listen to music is not isolated from the other. So, I mean, this is really, I know it's embarrassing, I shouldn't really have mentioned it, but the bit about lazy Italians. So you've got these other faculties of mind which are brought to bear in our musical experience. They're not isolated. The fact that we're listening in the way we are, and that we're also letting boats sink because we're too busy doing something else. Or, he would argue something like that, along with Plato. So there's a long tradition there, as opposed to a kind of, I mean, there's something very sort of, musicologists often object to Hanslink because it's all terribly autonomous. There's pure music, which is sort of separated from society and life and everything else, even the body. But I think for him, that's not quite right, because he's sort of, I think in the back of it, there's an issue about how far he's influenced by Kant. I think he's not much influenced directly by Kant's aesthetics, but the idea that there's the autonomous free self, and then there's the self of the body where we're, as it were, passive. You can be more or less active or passive in your thinking generally, and in your musical listening. And so I think he would probably say that more activity or autonomy could encourage more of the same, and more passivity encourages more of the same. But I can't recall any passages right now right on that point about whether music has consequences in the way that Plato thought it did. I think he thought more that it was an effect of attitudes in mind, but I'm really making that up as I speak.
I don't know if anybody else wants. It doesn't look.
Yeah, no, I'd have something to say about that. So the question perhaps relates slightly to the much discussed and ill-fated so-called Mozart effect, which was some work done in the late 1990s, which claimed to show that if you exposed people, in fact, particularly young children, to the music of Mozart, and actually ridiculously at one stage, it was even claimed a particular piece by Mozart, that this caused them to develop better cognitive abilities than if they were not exposed to that music. I mean, that work has been completely and thoroughly demolished by subsequent work that shows that that there is really no basis of fact in it. But I think what it leaves unexamined, or at least rather leaves open the possibility, is this: that, I mean, music is by its very nature as we've all been discussing, and in different ways, an extremely engaging form of material. It's engaging cognitively. I would claim it's also engaging emotionally, despite what Nick has been arguing today. It is certainly engaging bodily, and it is engaging both socially and individually. So in other words, it has very extraordinary capacities which are in some ways quite overlapping with language, quite overlapping with dance, quite overlapping with other complex forms of human cultural kind of development, but has its own particular domain. And it's undoubtedly the case that many of the capacities that are required, or that music engages, are also capacities that are engaged in other aspects of our lives. So it's not surprising that music has therapeutic value, for instance, because it engages communication skills and it engages a certain kind of bodily discipline, if you like, in order to be able to hit an instrument in a repeated and kind of systematic way, and so on. So I'm quite sure that music does have these consequences for human development, but I don't think we should think of them as being, magically connected to Mozart or anything like that. They are much more at the level of general behavior that they take place.
Okay, I think we have time for about 2 more questions. We've got more than that, so I'm going to apologize now if I don't get to your question. But here's one that also kind of extends the dimension of music. It says, please explain the audio-visual process with music and how it helps visualization and synesthesia. I suppose this is asking us to connect music with the visual system. Anybody want to have a go at that?
Yeah, well, I'll briefly have a go.
Sure.
Again, there is a great deal of work that's been done probably in the last 30 years showing how people's responses to music are extremely influenced by what they see at the same time as what they hear. So actually, there was a rather controversial piece of work published in about 2006 or 7 by a woman called Cha Jung Tse, which showed that if you show people silent video recordings of a well-known piano competition, the Tchaikovsky piano competition, show people silent video recordings of the finalists from that competition. Listeners, both naive listeners and musically trained listeners, will pick from the silent video the person who won the competition, and they will pick the competition winner more accurately from the video than if you just play them the audio. So we pick something up from seeing people perform that actually is a really good indicator of how competition judges also judge those people to have performed. And so, that's just one indication of the way in which there is incredibly rich information in the visual processing of musical performance. At the same time, we also know that there are famous examples of people who have profound musical synesthesia, that when they hear music in the absence of any visual stimulation, they have very powerful visual experiences. The composer Olivier Messiaen was one such person. The composer Scriabin was another such person. In fact, Scriabin wrote music with a kind of visual track and even a perfume track in the case of one piece that was never, I think, ever realized, in which he tried to express this kind of deeply synesthetic or multimodal experience he had when he heard music. And I think there have been famously neurophysiological explanations of why that is, a kind of, if you like, a leakage between parts of the brain, between the audio and the visual parts of the brain, about which Victoria would probably have much more to say than I can.
Yes, I would like to mention that the connectivity between the visual cortex and the auditory cortex is very rich. I don't see that there are any studies showing an increase in this connectivity in people having synesthesia. And there are several papers that have contradictory results. What I think that it happens is that we are, believe it or not, we are terrestrial mammals. Then we are visual people. We are visual animals. We use our vision from our everyday life, right? Yes, we use sounds, and sounds has an advantage that is omnidirectional. You can hear no matter where you are in space, whereas visual, our eyes are in the frontal space, then we cannot see anything that is behind us. And one of the most important functions of the auditory system of hearing is just taking into account what happened behind us, just to direct our eyes towards the object. But we are visual mammals. Then I think that in general, visual world has prevalence over auditory world. Saying that, the connectivity between the visual system and the auditory system is very rich, even at the level of the cortex. Then it's not strange that you can assign different colors to different sounds, or different sounds in higher centers can evoke warmer or cold colors.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to end with this question. I'm going to ask you for a brief answer. I like the question because it sort of takes us out gently. Why is it that music can be one of the last things to go from the memory of patients with dementia? Any thoughts on that?
Reminiscence.
That's a nice one to think, yeah.
The kind of deeply embedded nature of musical memories with the sense of self, as I was arguing in my own paper.
And as you said, it starts before we're born, and it's almost the last things to go. So
Yeah.
thank you very much. It's a very interesting sort of moment to end on. Thank you to all our speakers. That was just terrific. Things do work online. I kind of miss being in the flesh and being together, but this does work. It has its own charms. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to speak to us. I want to thank the technicians at St. Hilda's, because I didn't mention them. Without them, we could not do this online event. So thank you to Harris Ferguson. Thank you to our administrative staff, Claire Harvey and Melissa Kelly. And thank all the people who joined us tonight. If any of you want to catch up on this again to hear some of those answers to those questions, or even the talks again, it'll be available online indefinitely, as far as I know. And as far as I'm promise you that next year we're going to come back with another series of 3 events, one each term. So keep an eye on our website and we'll keep you posted as soon as we're able to do that. Thank you all very much, and I'll say good night. Good night all.